Thank you very much, Amy, and thank you all for being here. As Amy said, the way we're going to work this, it's all unrehearsed, so for an academic who's used to having everything sort of planned in advance, for me this is working without a safety net. But James is first of all going to talk about his own work for a few minutes, and then we're going to chat about it and some of the issues, and particularly issues that I, as a historian of 19th century art, and particularly sculpture, have sort of got from James's work. I should also add that I'm a bit starstruck, so if I start just squeaking and dribbling, James will take over. But James, perhaps you'd like to start off.
Well, I need my remote there. I didn't want to, but I wanted to make sure that when I spoke to you that you knew my work. I'm not that feel in my head that I'm that well known that everybody knows what I do. This is the artifact piece, and as we say in Indian, it happened over there. The Museum of Man, and was a jump start to my career here. I looked at this piece as a defining work for me about keeping things simple, a performance and installation. Apparitions 1. A message about our belief in archival photos, particularly of Indian people, and where many of us become stuck as far as our perceptions of, what Native people are. And of course, I'm never, ever surprised as far as the misconceptions and the lack of knowledge as far as our local tribes go, which I'm a member of Puyakichum people from the La Jolla Indian Reservation. These are the boys in Willie's backyard under the Ramada by his horseshoe pit with Ipai singers in the clouds. Piece that's in the show, but this is quite different, and I'm actually quite happy with this piece. The piece that's in the show is called Half Indian, Half Mexican, shot in 1992 by Mr. Richard Liu, very good friend and well-known San Diego-based artist at one time. And I shot it again in 1911 and put them together for Half Indian, Half Mexican 1992/2011 because it's a body piece. And this whole body changed during that 20 years. And finally, this piece that just went up at Denver Museum of Nature and Science, which I'm really quite proud of, and actually it's almost coming full circle because my premier work started at an anthropological museum, and it was the perfect place to speak to the subject matter of representation. And so I was invited to the museum, and was on the second floor in the dioramas amongst the other Indian dummies, along with the rest of the floor of stuffed animals. And that alone can tell you a little bit about the perception or misconception of who we are, and of course all about the past. So I took this piece called Making Do, about my own family, about the turn of the century here in San Diego, a very important period because we had lost our gathering and hunting grounds. We were put on reservations. Catholicism became a dominant portion of our culture. Our children were sent to boarding schools. And so I spoke to that. This is a particular one of religion and family artifacts, including my great-great-uncle Sinan Duro, the last Matawir from the Mesa Grande Reservation, and a wider shot of the piece. It's very subversive. It just doesn't look like it.
Great, thank you very much. While Alexander's just changing over the PowerPoint, the first thing I wanted to hear your thoughts about was, given that we're here because of this magnificent exhibition about American art and its sort of trajectory through the last 3 centuries, and given that your work challenges assumptions, it challenges self-evident labels, it unsettles the preconceptions people have, how do you think about your work in this context? Do you think of yourself as an American artist?
Yes. Yes, I do. I'm an American Indian. That label of Native American never quite stuck. It seemed to come forward a little late for me and a little too academic. And as some of my tribal members, bros, had put it, you know, there's a lot of us that had died for that. Though incorrect, American Indian, you know, fits the thing. But, you know, the moment that my work became, I think, strong or stronger was when I stopped being in denial of the American part of myself and tried to stop making Indian art. And the American part of myself was growing up in Orange County, near my reservation, being an urban/reservation Indian, of going through my various periods of independence, which left my community, my body was speechless, of going out for sports, being the junior class president, being in art and going through my surf and hippie periods. But you know, that was a defining moment for me, and I seemed to leave that behind in what I was speaking to. And when I included that in my work, it became stronger because it became whole.
No, that makes perfect sense, because it seems to me one of the key themes and one of the most important themes in your whole oeuvre, in a sense, is this sense of getting your culture, Indians, the tribes, back into history, to sort of, you know, refuse that that they're just something that happened over there, frankly, that it's something that's an ongoing, continuous history that your work is part of.
Yeah, we're alive and well, and we're much more than casinos.
Yes. About this kind of question of history, these are, of course, 3 shots from your piece, Petroglyphs in Motion. And I wonder whether, first of all, you'd just like to outline for the audience what this work was and what it was about.
Yeah, well, for me, personally, it was about rejecting what I felt I was becoming, which is the Laurie Anderson of American Indian art. There was just too much tech, too much props, and I found myself, you know, getting away from the basics. So like I said, looking at the artifact piece for a sensibility, a focal point to like less is more. And so in this piece, there were simple costumes, just laid out on a table. The whole idea about a petroglyph, which, you know, I'm surrounded by on the reservation, for me is the fascination of looking at a little peck, a little drawing, something sculptural, and telling this wonderful story that, for most part, I'm making up in my mind. And so I wanted them to come alive, and so this was the Petroglyphs in Motion. And so none of these stories really made any sense. They were all independent, but somehow together they made sense. And I played to a live rock drummer, Daryl Virgil-Gray, a Hickory Apache that just pounded the drums for this 2-hour performance at Site Santa Fe. It was a wonderful moment for me because it let me free. It was totally impromptu, you know, like us right now.
Yes, yeah.
Breaking free.
It seems to me this sense of the word motion seems particularly important. Again, is this sense of sort of reclaiming history, of turning your body, in a sense, from what it was in the artifact piece, the dead anthropological object, or kind of part of that trajectory, into something real. I'm now going to venture a little bit of criticism or sort of historical analysis, which again is always dangerous when you're talking to an artist, because there's always the possibility he'll stand up and say, "You've misunderstood everything about my work." But I was thinking again as a historian of 19th century sculpture about a work like this, which is The Ghost Dancer by Paul Wayland Bartlett, made in 1890. And you may know the Ghost Dance was part, in a sense, of Indian resistance in the late 19th century, where Voka, a Paiute Indian, created this new religion, at the heart of which was the ghost dance, which would dance, in a way, history into reverse, reunite the living and dead spirits, and banish the white colonizers from the land. And here Bartlett uses this figure, this rather kind of grotesque representation. He's presenting this in the Salon in Paris, and as an American sculptor, he's using indigenous subject matter to show he's American, he's different from European sculptors. But what interested me about this work in relation to Petroglyphs in Motion was this, in a sense, this sense of the body again coming to life, or playing with that. And it seems to me if Wovoka and the Ghost Dance wanted to dance history into reverse, and Paul Wayland Bartlett freezes the body in time, it's sort of the sculpture's a rather neat metaphor for the idea of the Indian as a relic, a kind of an object that's lost to the past. It seemed to me you were trying to sort of dance that body back into history and back into the present.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful comparison. In actuality, the performance started out with me running mechanical so that you could see every muscle in my body, that it became sort of like a slow motion, sort of a reaction to the statuesque Indian that never speaks back, you know, and I speak back,
Yeah.
you know, and yeah.
And presumably this is something
I've never seen that before. Thank you.
Something that performance art particularly can do, because it's action, because it's motion, because it's across time. I know you've said in the past that performance is of particular use or value for the kinds of things you want to do.
Well, when I stumbled into performance, everything opened up for me because there were no boundaries, and I was a young man, you know, going through all this inner turmoil, political turmoil, cultural turmoil, and here I was offered a voice to speak to all these things. I just took the ball and ran with it. And fortunately, I was a painter, though, and that kind of kept me in sync because I took that discipline with me. I wrote for my paintings, I write for my performance. There's no difference between choosing a color for a painting as opposed to choosing lighting. There's timing in painting, believe it or not, and there's time is everything in performance, and there is composition. So let me share that with you.
I'd like to ask you a little more and talk a little more about the question of the body, the Indian body. And here, just as an example, is The Passing of the Buffalo by Cyrus Dallin from 1929, which is a big public sculpture in Muncie, Indiana, and seemed to me a kind of a perfect example of this idealized, fetishized, desirable Indian body that's increasingly represented as real Indian bodies are eliminated, marginalized, destroyed. So it's sort of as if this myth can replace what's been eliminated.
You mean we don't all look like that?
Well, you do, obviously, but...
underneath all this, I
exactly, yes, yeah. But it seems to me this kind of object also your work speaks to in a number of ways. And first and foremost, public space. It strikes me as sort of deeply ironic that the Indian figure is literally at the center of public space at exactly a moment when real bodies are excluded from that space. It's the symbol that's most American and also what America excludes in a way.
Yeah, and let me share this. For me, when I see this, yes, this is closer to what we look like before we were introduced to the epidemic of diabetes, which is connected to social, economic factors. poverty, bad food, isolation, and then from that generating social problems. So when I look to that, it's actually they sadden me, because of what we had, who we were, but not that we still aren't that. It's just that well, I don't think you can go back. I really don't, but it's something to work for. And in our communities currently, there's a resurgence to get more cultural, to bring back the languages and better diets based on indigenous foods. It's quite a wonderful thing happening.
I'm glad you mentioned this, because if I just move forward, this was the next thing that I wanted to ask you about. Against this ideal body, it seems that your work, in a sense, deals with real bodies, literal bodies, bodies that aren't kind of perfected. So in the sense of personas, characters who are in wheelchairs, broken bodies, the scars that were sort of signalled in the artifact piece. Or in this Emendatio, the wonderful work that this was for the Venice Biennale originally, yes? This ritual circle, which includes spam, insulin, and syringes. And after all, this too is a representation of the body. Mm-hmm. Is this a particular kind of something you've particularly wanted to take up in your work, this way in which the Indian body has changed and its distance from the sort of body of the past, the ideal body, the fetishized body?
Well, yeah, I think, well, the work itself, I think, when I made that turn and said, do something that's whole, then it to me, that's also spoke to it being real. Take my own experiences. If I'm going to talk about dysfunction, then I'll talk about mine. And I think when I do stuff like that, people get a stronger feeling, a sense of it. And this is me. This is part of my life. It's part of my daily ritual, my insulin injections, checking my blood, and a constant struggle to eat good, and But it's also kind of a battle that, in some ways, no hard you try, it's terrible. You lose. You start to lose certain things about your abilities, But you just work. You just keep it up, and then even that becomes a part of your life. So, that's the reasoning. Mm-hmm. The other one is it's also a message, for everybody, not just Native people. I mean, if I was to ask people to raise their hand, which I won't right now, about, how many people here are afflicted themselves or have friends that are afflicted by diabetes. The hands would shoot up, and all you have to do is go to a buffet and you see all these people waddle in, and it's what we're doing to ourselves, and consumption.
And again, in relation to this, how much of this is about class? And perhaps this is a particularly European question, or a particularly British question, since everything about Britain boils down to class. But it's just looking at this as a person from the other side of the Atlantic. Spam. My mother used to make us spam fritters for dinner once a week as children. Very good they were too. Yeah. But it was very much a working class food.
Very.
Diabetes, again, in Britain, we're having the same epidemic, but it's very much working class communities who are most afflicted by this. And also the clothing on this, I think that you call this persona the lounge Luna,
yes.
Which I rather like. Again, it's a certain kind of clothing which in Britain would immediately signal a class identity or a place in the social structure. Is that also at stake here in America?
It's well, yeah, and it's also, what is class? It's changed so much, but particularly for the entertainment field, people get out there and these outrageous things. As a matter of fact, this is from the Fabric Workshop in Philadelphia, who I was so happy to be chosen to work with, and they say, well, what do you need? We'll make it. And so I was thinking about this lounge suit, and so I immediately sent them album covers of the Temptations and My Girl. And then The Nutty Professor, Jerry Lewis's version, with those wonderful suits in there. And they put together this, but they fell short of finding real shark skin. So we settled for iridescent silk. But, you know, when I put that on, it became regalia. See, now, in the Indian way, there's a big difference between putting on, and you never say this, I'm going to put on my dance costume. No, we don't wear costumes. We wear regalia. You know, you wear your outfit. And when you put that on, you know, you start to transcend things. You become, you know, powerful. You become cultural. And for those few hours at the powwow where you're out there dancing, you know, you forget about the world. You know, you're in the Indian world now. And I felt that way with my lounge suits. Plus, there was a little thing there about, because along with that went the high-tech war shirt. And they were in the sky, and it was called The Virtues of Evil and Goodness Await My Ascension. It was about a funeral. And so these two deities were in the air, but you got to choose who was virtue and who was goodness.
I mean, following on from this idea, again, because I was thinking about this in terms of class, I was also thinking about the economic sphere in a way, and whether that's, I mean, clearly in some of your work, you ask the audience for money. There are kind of characters who beg. There are characters who ask for money. But there's also something very interesting that you said in the piece, Take a Picture with a Real Indian, where when you're talking to the audience and inviting them to have their picture taken with a real Indian, talking about the relationship with America, you say something to the effect that America doesn't want Indians in poverty, it doesn't want Indians wealthy, as if there's a wish to kind of remove them from social structures, from economic structures altogether, and again have them living in a fantasy world, the fantasy world of Westerns and the landscape. Is that right? Is there a sense in which the removal of Indians from history as a kind of a primitive something to look back on is also about removing them from social structures and economic structures? Again, trying to create a kind of fantasy figure who hovers outside that, which you're then trying to correct.
Yeah, I played on people's history and culture, you know, by having them decide between three Indian figures which one they wanted to take a picture with. I came out in a simple leather breechcloth. You know, I was a California Indian. We didn't need all this. The weather was, you know, we were part of our geography. So people, you know, kind of come out, and then they say this little oratory. Take a picture with a real Indian. Take a picture today here at the Copley Museum with a real Indian. America loves to say, our Indians. America likes to see us dance for them. America likes our arts and crafts. Take a picture with a real Indian here today. Take two, leave one, take one home. And then I come out in my street clothes, and people don't seem as interested. I don't know why. And so the crowd, you know, it's kind of mixed. They're talking and stuff. And then the last figure is coming out in a war dance regalia, and people actually go, ooh, you know, and they line up, but there's a curious thing happening because this is entrapment, and I never thought about it. I never was that smart to think about, you know, exactly, you know, what it would throw on the audience, or there's little debate circles, you know, that are talking like, should I get up there or not? Well, yeah, let's do it for arts, or, you know, this is cool, you know. And so this debate kind of happens, and then people get up. And then I say that again. And the installation stands as three life-size figures with this oratory talking. And maybe hits home a little more then, I'm not sure. But when I say this oratory, you know, people kind of forget and get up there to take a picture anyway. Mm-hmm. But as a side note, I was going through the family archives, my mother's cardboard box full of family photos, and she goes, here. And it was me and my brother and my sister at Knott's Berry Farm, with war bonnets taking a picture with a real Indian.
That's fantastic. In fact, have I got? Oh no. Yes, here's a picture of the performance done on Columbus Day in 2010 in DC outside the Columbus Monument.
Yeah, they almost look surreal, eh?
Mm-hmm. It's and here it just seemed to have a particular resonance. Again, not least because it's at the very heart of public space. And people choosing, particularly in the image on the right, people choosing the Indian they want in that public space rather than the guy in his street clothes.
Yeah. And let me say this, the National American Indian, is our museum. And I'm so happy and proud to be, affiliated with them. But also this piece spoke loud because the director, he wanted to do something special for Columbus Day. And the people got together and said, "By James Luna." And so there it was. It was a wonderful moment. But
there was also having seen a video of this performance, not this one, but an earlier version of it. There's, for me, what's a very poignant moment when you walk in and you stand in front of the cardboard cutouts and look at your two-dimensional represented self. And I don't know whether it's meant to be poignant, but it seemed to sum up someone looking not only at his own history, but the history of his own people, and the tension between being a person and being a representation, being a cardboard cutout for a white audience.
Well, I also believe, this is maybe coming to me in my age or something, and it's certainly, something that I was brought up with you, that when you become older, if you're lucky, that and things come to you, as an elder. And I certainly believe that there's a magic moment in performance, where I transcend into somebody else. And maybe I was thinking that when I was looking at my own image, that I've been given this gift, and a gift that I'm still trying to fathom. But there's a mystical thing going on stage or wherever I happen to be, and become, something other than myself.
The final topic I want to address is sort of modernity and modernism. And again, this is something I've been thinking about recently, which again comes from something you say in Take a Picture, where you talk about America using tribal names for cars and trucks, also film festivals and so forth. But this struck me as very kind of important and interesting, and again another way in which America wants the Indian, but transforms it into something useful for them. And I thought of Indian motorcycles. An obvious example, when Hendy and Hedstrom started the company in 1901, they wanted an American name, and their view was what was more American than Indian. And they went so far as to the factory was called the Wigwam. The management were called the Chiefs, and even on the website today, the riders of Indian motorcycles, they refer to as Indian warriors. And it seemed to me that what was happening here was white America was taking the qualities it admired from native peoples, from strength, vigor, speed, all those sort of cliches in a way.
Hair in the wind.
Yes, exactly. Hair in the wind. It's an Indian horsemanship in a modern guise, but in a sense, literally objectifying that. You take those qualities, but you get rid of the actual Indian body. It becomes a machine that you can own and use. And the logo too interests me. Again, this sort of two-dimensional. It's the shape of the tank. It's the lines that suggest the speed. But again, it seems to me to be sort of both using the Indian for modern America,
Yeah.
but in doing that, consigning the Indian to the past.
Yeah, I'm good with this. You know, there's two things, and well, one, I'm a great fan of American Indian cultures. There's not a culture, there's cultures, and one of the most gratifying things as an artist is to travel, particularly in the United States, and go out to these less populated areas, and I ask, you know, for the Indian community, and because it was always of interest to me to see what they do out that way, what they eat, you know, what they laugh at, and it's very similar, but it's different, and ways, as we call it, of thinking and doing things. But the other one is a great admirer and fan of American pop culture, you know, and that this is that patriotism part of me, maybe, or, you know, even that's hard to say, but a liking for an understanding and appreciation for being American. You know, that this is how much more American can you get from this, along with jazz and rock and roll, which I use a lot in my work, because it breaks down barriers between us. It brings in memories and romance and emotions, and you know, you know, I think we forget about that, and you know, despite what certain political parties would want to think, you know, this border is not going to go away. You know, it's an integral part of San Diego, its history and culture, along with Native people. And, you know, it's something to celebrate rather than deny.
And in which case, I wonder what you think of this. This is Marsden Hartley's painting Indian Fantasy from 1914. Hartley, of course, an important American modernist and one of those who's looking to Indian cultures as a way of kind of challenging or finding an alternative to the urban, to the industrial, to capitalism, and so forth, and dreaming of a kind of a fantasy life at one with nature out west. But again, what interested me here was the way in which this fantasy seemed to rely on figures that are rather like cardboard cutouts and replaceable, repetitious, the same figure over and over again, just a kind of a symbol of a fantasy Indian. Again, there's this same sense of a modernist admiring and wanting, in a way, dreaming of being part of this culture, but flattening it out into a kind of a two-dimensional world outside history.
Kind of makes me wonder what he was smoking. Well, the other thing, though, there's some great representation by other artists. There's some wonderful Indian motifs by Roy Lichtenstein, early stuff that's just incredible, and even Jackson Pollock, when our father, you know, quoted himself as feeling like a Navajo sand painter when he was creating this stuff on the floor. I cut that out and had it in my wall for a number of years because I thought, all right, Jackson.
Yeah. No, that's a very interesting comparison with that, because Pollock sees himself as engaging in that kind of practice, in the actual culture itself, rather than an image of it, rather than a representation of it, a sort of, and it's telling that Hartley calls this Indian fantasy. Invented. And this sort of, in a way, led back to my last question, which again relates to, I suppose, a work like Take a Picture, which is Hartley, his heart's in the right place. He, you know, wants to love Indian cultures, but somehow seems to caricature it or flatten it out. Do you worry about how you stop sympathetic audiences simply projecting their own fantasies or preconceptions back onto you? If you're trying to break those down and challenge them, is there sometimes a problem that, you know, in the way that in Take a Picture they will go for the Indian in full regalia?
Well, there's a lot of ways to approach that, and I guess this comes from, well, I guess from trial and error and experience, that in the early years, work was pretty confrontive, and I've re-strategized over the years, and it's still confrontive, it's still subversive, But, you know, it's a little more tactful, because it came to find that if you do this, you know, people aren't going to listen to you, you know, so you just bring them in, and, you know. And the other thing is, you know, rather than separate us, I talk first about the similarities of us as people, and then the differences. You know, the other way seems a little harder. So that's become my new strategy of sort, though I veer off every so often. Like the piece in Denver, we become them. I was quite happy because it's subtle. It fits into the diorama culture up there. But when you read it, it's about contemporary things, you know, things that they can identify with. And I didn't have a good slide of it, but I ended on a note of warriors. But I use veterans, Indian veterans from the Korea War on. Because when you walk into an Indian house and there's boys and women that have been veterans, their photos are proudly displayed. You know, and I think some people have a little kind of trouble with that, or not trouble, but just kind of question about, well, you know, you guys are part of the service, just like when they see us with a cowboy hat. Well, we live in the country. We live in the country. We live with cows and horses. You know, that's part of it. But why we are the most highest percentage of any ethnic group in America that had joined the American services, there's a little twist there. Because we're not, I think, generally fighting for the government, we're fighting for our country. And that's a big difference.
That's a really great point to end on. So thank you all for listening, and thanks to the wonderful James Luna.
Thank you, Michael.